Hi, I'm Amy Furness, the Rosamond Ivey Special Collections Archivist and Head of Library and Archives of the Art Gallery of Ontario. Thanks for joining me to take a closer look at the archives of sculptors Frances Loring and Florence Wyle. I'm speaking to you in virtual space, but here where I sit and where the AGO operates is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit Anishinaabe Nation. It's also been the home of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and many First Nations have met in Toronto over time. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and to work on this land. As we continue the theme this spring of portraits, portraits of resilience and self-portraits, I want to share some thoughts about how someone's archives can be thought of as a kind of self-portrait, although there's limitations to that idea, but that's what we'll get into. So today I'm talking about, in particular, the sculptors Frances Loring, who we see here on the right, and Florence Wyle. Loring was born in 1887 and lived till 1968. Wyle was born in 1881, died in 1968, and they died within a few months of each other. So they were based in Toronto. They were partners in life and in work. And they lived in, their studio was in their home was in a converted schoolhouse on Glenrose Avenue in Midtown Toronto, which we can see here in the 1950s. Loring and Wyle are really beloved by many artists and art lovers alike, partly for the beauty of their work, but I think largely because of the generosity, the openness, and the free-spiritedness in which they lived, but the way that they welcomed people into their studio, both artists and neighbors, particularly children, and the way that they taught people. And also for the generosity with which they approached their legacy, where everything went to sculptors, artists, and the Canadian people. So here's a glimpse inside the studio in the 1940s. You can see there's lessons underway and lots of beautiful clutter of all kinds of artistic making. Loring and Wyle's archives are at the AGO, as should be evident, in addition to numerous artworks. So really their main legacy, I guess you could say, is at the AGO. And their archives were donated by their estates in 1983. So when I say archives, just to be clear, I'm talking about documentary material that we collect in the special collections in the library. So it's not works of art per se, but it's more material that documents a life and work. It's often thought of as the byproduct of activity. So, evidence of the artistic process, although I think it can definitely be intentionally created. Archives could be photographs, could be letters, could be sketchbooks or other kinds of documents. Those are sort of the traditional kind of core things that you might find in an artist's archives. But every archive is unique. And what we do in the library and archives is to bring that material in to support future research. And I just want to point out in this photograph what it looks like from an archivist's eye. Obviously there's a lot of activity going on, but my eye might be drawn to the corner here in the middle of the photo where we can see a desk. There's just the sign of some papers here, some books on the shelf. There's more material over here, some things kind of tucked away in the corner, evidence of materials, that kind of thing. And those would be potentially, although not necessarily, things that one could find in the archive. Talking about Loring and Wyle's archive in particular, it contains around 600 photographs, so quite a lot. Most of those are photos of their work, but it also includes images of the artists and their studios, and their studio, like we see here. There's also some paper-based documentation, including a very few letters. They didn't keep a lot in the way of letters. Some lecture notes, Florence Wyle's poetry, both in manuscript form and then as she developed it into books, and newspaper clippings, that kind of self-documentation, which one frequently finds in the archives of people who have a public life, and personal documents, an example of which we see here. Not very many of these, but here's Florence Wyle's passport from the 20s on the left. I can't remember if I mentioned at the beginning, they were both American citizens who moved and made their home in Toronto fairly early in life. And here's a family photograph from Frances Loring and her father from her early adulthood. Here's Frances Loring at work, probably around 1920. And again, as an archivist, I look at the shelves, I look at the kinds of papers that we see here, and perhaps things that are unfinished, that are not quite ready to be artwork, but which show the evidence of how somebody worked, what they did. So normally these days, I get to work with artists while they're still alive to help shape their archive, and do that as a kind of conversation and an exploration where we look in the studio and we really make a conscious decision about what should go into an archive. So in this instance, because by the time the artist's archive was pulled together, they were long dead. Um, it was done by their estate. And this was done before there was a professional archivist on the staff of the AGO even. So their archive, we can really only glimpse the way it was kept through these kinds of photographs. And these photos are by other people, of course, who aren't really focusing on the archive at all, as should be clear. Um, their archive, in this case, contains no diaries and no really direct forms of self-representation. So I'm pretty sure that Loring and Wyle would not have thought of it as any kind of self-portrait at all. Um, and in fact, there's no evidence that they really thought of the archive as an archive at all, or even an asset necessarily. It's not actually mentioned in their wills, although they were clear about the wish that their artwork should be given to public collections in Canada. So giving the archives to an institution is consistent in that sense. But it was a decision that the executors of their estate would have had to make. Just a side note that Frances Loring did have a small quantity of family papers that she wished to go to her nieces and nephews. So we can see her here. This is kind of as close as I can get to a conversation with the artist. And again, there's sort of an intriguing shelf along the radiator behind her. We can imagine some papers might be also her tools laid aside on the floor beside her. I love that. Um, so again, this archive in its sort of natural living habitat can only be glimpsed through photographs. What happens to an archive and to a studio after they stop being living and working things is that an artist's estate, in this case, the shared estate made a decision about what would go into the archive as best they could. In that sense, executors would play kind of a smaller role as being co-creators, not quite co-creators, but they would play a kind of authorship role in creating an archive. And arguably that's what's happened here. And then the archivist would play a role, sort of deciding what goes into the archive and organizing it and representing it. We need to write catalogs of this material, and you can find the catalog of, it's called a finding aid, of Loring and Wyle's archive if you look on the website of the Library of the AGO. But of course, there's constraints about what institutions do and what they don't do. Storage is a big one. And the fit between the categories of artwork and archive, which is never straightforward. So this rather, I guess, subdued or depressing photo is it's actually kind of wonderful what's in here, but this is an image of the shelves in the vault at the AGO where we keep archival materials. So as you can see, there's a certain sameness to it after it's being translated into the institution. Everything kind of goes into uniform gray boxes. And that's what happens. And so it ends up looking very, very different. And in a sense, then there's the input of the archivist into what eventually becomes the archive. Let's go back to a more interesting photograph here. So we can see Florence Wyle stoking the furnace in the studio. Just a further note that in the case of Loring and Wyle, the category of artwork is also a little bit complicated by the way in which they worked. Because of the expense of creating sculpture on a huge scale, they used plaster models as a first step of creating their work. And they would paint these often to resemble the kind of material in which they could imagine finally rendering these sculptures. For example, to look like bronze with a green patina on it, or to look like stone. In this instance, in the background, you can see the goalie, which is in the collection of the AGO, and it was never cast. It remains in plaster. I'm not sure if this torso, which I think is the one in the National Gallery, might already be carved into stone there, or whether it's still in plaster, but that's sort of the mode in which they carried on. The expectation was that they would then find a buyer who would cover the cost of materials to have the work rendered, either cast or carved into its final form. But it's interesting because the plasters, in a sense, are closer to the hand of the artist. There's a sort of immediacy to them, and there's certainly a beauty and a finish to them, even though they're, in a sense, preparatory to something that was intended. So, lots to think about there. Um, Maybe this has just given you a preliminary sense then of what we end up with in an artist's archive being a very complex kind of self-representation. But it is one that gets looked at very closely by all kinds of researchers who are looking for insights into the person or the people who made it. In some ways, it gets treated like a self-portrait, even if it's definitely more complicated than that. And here again, I started with this image, but perhaps from some of my remarks, you might start to look at some of the things in the background and see works in process, some materials, just the activity of the studio. I guess an obvious difference between an archive and a self-portrait is that a self-portrait is usually intentional, but it's also filtered in some ways through the artist's self-consciousness, their ideas about artistic style, what is expected and what is allowed. Um, so there it is. I give you archives. They may be less intentional, they may be not clearly self-portraits, and they're filtered in a different way, but they do remain there as a very meaningful and unique self-representation by artists. Thanks very much for joining me.